Hello guys, thanks for joining me. I thought that I would show you these three items today. They're probably my rarest items in my collection. They're not the most expensive items, but they are my rarest Third Reich or Wehrmacht items in my collection. And as you can see, there are three projectiles. And the photograph at the beginning of the video would have shown the cannon that they were used for, and that is the, as I say, the MG151. It was developed in the late 1930s. It was produced from 1940 until the end of the war. It was initially produced in 50mm caliber, but very quickly they upgraded the caliber to 20mm. And what I've got here are the earlier 50mm rounds. So these are 15.1 by 96mm. And as I say, the projectiles and the cannons, it's an automatic cannon. They were used throughout the war, and they were actually used after the war. Several of the very first Cold War or post-war jet planes were armed with the MG151, and the French used them extensively after the war as well. Anyhow, I'm just going to be talking about my three shells here. So as I say, they were developed in the late 1930s, and these are armor piercing and high explosive shells that I've got here. I've got two high explosive shells, which are the ones on either side, and the one in the middle is a armor piercing shell. So what I'm going to do next is I'll show you a quick video clip of a Luftwaffe attack on an American B-17 bomber, and then I'll talk more about the shells afterwards. Right, after watching that little clip, you'll have seen the explosive effects of these shells hitting a target, a plane in that case. And as I say, I've got two high explosive shells and one armor piercing shell. They're obviously inert. They're no longer live shells, obviously. Just as a comparison to size, that is a 7.92 Mauser clip. Just to give you an idea of the size of these shells. And the Germans call the high explosive shell the Sprenggranatenpatrone, and they had about 2 grams of explosive in the tip, the shell. The armor piercing shell was called the Panzergranatpatrone by the Germans, and it is a 52-gram solid shell. And I believe it's steel-coated tungsten. Anyhow, the shells would have been activated with fuses, and the shells that I've got actually still have the fuses. You can just unscrew them. And as you can see, it's hollow on the inside, would have contained the explosives on the inside, and there's a little contact fuse here. You can see the contact metal on the top here that would have exploded on hitting a target, whether an airplane, a truck, or whatever. And that just screws into the end here. The armor piercing shell would have had a penetration of 18mm at 100 meters. But again, useful for damaging aircraft. You can imagine the damage that these would have done on an aircraft being hit. I know the explosive shells also had, some of them, especially later ones, had a self-destruct fuse. I'm not quite sure exactly how it worked, but basically you can imagine that if you're firing these high explosive shells at an airplane, and if you miss the aircraft, these shells would fall back onto the earth, obviously, and possibly cause damage, explode on the ground, cause injuries and what have you, especially when they were fighting over Germany. With the bombing raids over Germany, you wouldn't want the shells hitting innocent parties down below. So I believe a lot of the later ones had self-destruct fuses, which I believe are activated by the tracer. These all have tracer elements, so it could well be that the fuse would have been exploded by the end of the tracer burn. But anyhow, it's quite a nice item. Here you can see I've got the 3 shells. The actual bodies is lacquered steel, and even better, I've got the links here. I've got 3 links to go with the shells. The MG151 was usually fed by a 60 round drum, though I believe some of the other aircraft and the armored car that you saw in the photograph at the beginning would have had larger capacity drums, up to 200 rounds per cannon. But the aircraft were usually supplied with 60 round drums, and these links are even rarer than the actual cartridges, so I'm very happy to have these items. A little bit rusty, obviously. The links are maker marked, as are the shells. I'll do some photographs, obviously, and show you the markings, but there are various markings on these shells. 2 of these shells are 1943 dated, and 1 is 1942 dated. So I'm very happy to have that particular item in my collection. So as I say, these are the 15mm shells, and as I said, after a year of production, the MG151 was upgraded to 20mm shells. And to prevent any complications of having to redevelop the cannon, they basically used the 50mm shells. They cut down the cartridge length, so there was less powder in the shells, and they had a less range than the 50mm shells. And then they just put the 20mm shell tops or tips there, and it just meant they had to change the barrel, and a couple of internal parts were changed, but basically the cannon itself required very little change from 15 to 20mm. Effective range of the 50mm shells would have been about a kilometer, about 1,000 meters. The velocity of these shells would have been approximately 850 meters per second for the high explosive shell, and because the armor piercing shell is more streamlined, it had a muzzle velocity of about 1,000 meters per second. And the MG151 had a cyclic rate of about 700 rounds per minute. What I like about these are they're quite nice salty condition, and I like the remains of the paint on the projectiles, especially the one here. You can see the bands here. That's a copper bands I would have dug into the rifling of the barrel, and they're in very good condition considering. As I say, they're not that easy to find nowadays, and you can imagine that millions of these would have been produced during the war, but they were fired and what have you, and lost and everything else. So I mean, it's not very easy to find these shells. So I'm very happy to have them in my collection, especially with the links here. As I say, the links are very difficult to find these days. So anyhow, I think I'll leave it at that. So that's my 3 15.1 by 96 centimeter cartridges for the MG151 autocannon. Anyhow, as always, thanks for watching, and bye for now.